A wealthy CEO experiences an instant connection with the awkward and late bridesmaid at his friend's wedding. Before we dive into the tale, please share a comment about your location while you're tuning in. Delight in the narrative. Emily hurried through the hotel hallways, gripping the hem of her dress as she navigated the risk of twisting her ankle in heels that had once felt like the perfect choice. Yet at this moment, a final verdict. The strategy was straightforward. Get there ahead of time, assist with the setup, and truly stand out as a bridesmaid. Yet, naturally, the cosmos chose today as the ideal moment to challenge her endurance. Initially, the taxi arrived later than expected. In a startling moment, a careless driver came dangerously close to hitting her at the hotel entrance. To add to her troubles, the elevator meant to whisk her directly to the ballroom was crammed, compelling her to dash up the stairs. She would undoubtedly take home the title for the most accident-prone bridesmaid ever. Apologies, 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 she murmured with each jolt, leaving the guests in a state of confusion. She stood merely a few paces distant. Emily could already sense the soft buzz of conversation from within the ballroom, signaling that the ceremony was on the verge of beginning. And then it unfolded. Bam! Emily collided with an unyielding object. Or perhaps an individual. The force was so intense that her bouquet soared through the air, her purse tumbled to the ground, and she almost made contact with the hotel's lavish carpet. Yet, just as she was about to plunge into chaos, firm hands seized her by the waist, averting a complete disaster. The aroma of a luxurious fragrance enveloped her, momentarily causing her to lose track of even her own identity. "Oh no! Please tell me I didn't just hit an elderly man," she whispered, struggling to steady herself. "I can assure you, I am not an old man." The rich, resonant voice caused her to blink several times before she finally lifted her gaze to meet the eyes of the man who had his hands around her waist. Emily almost gasped for breath. What sort of genetic injustice was this? The man before her appeared as though he had just emerged from the pages of a high-end fashion magazine. With dark hair impeccably arranged, striking blue eyes that seem to see right through you, and an undeniable presence that commands authority. His expression blended curiosity with a hint of amusement. "You have arrived later than expected." Emily's eyes grew large with surprise. "Excellent," he had a keen eye as well. "Thanks for the enlightening observation. Do you have any other fascinating insights to offer?" The corner of his lips lifted slightly. Yet Emily had no time for flirtation or for contemplating just how absurdly charming that smirk was. She attempted to retreat swiftly, yet sensed a pull on her dress. As she glanced down, a wave of embarrassment washed over her as she realized the fabric had snagged on her heel. "Oh, wonderful, as if stumbling by myself wasn't sufficient. Now I find myself ensnared as well." The man lowered himself gracefully, unfastening the fabric with a fluid gesture. "You are now free to proceed with your perilous endeavor." "I was already en route." Just as she was about to flee, he remarked, "I trust you have life insurance, because at this rate you won't survive the buffet." Emily sighed dramatically, snatched her belongings from the ground, and stormed away, refusing to glance back. Yet amidst the turmoil, his voice echoed in her mind. "Refrain from casting your gaze in his direction. Avoid making eye contact with him." Emily recited to herself like a sacred chant as she found her position among the bridesmaids. The ceremony was already in full swing, and the bride, her closest companion, Clara, was casting a fierce glare in her direction. Yet Emily's attention was drawn solely to the formidable presence among the groomsmen, the individual involved in the accident. He stood before her, his eyes fixed on her with that scrutinizing look once more. "Who is that?" she murmured to one of the bridesmaids next to her. "Brian Fisher. What makes it important for me to know who he is?" "He holds the title of one of the wealthiest individuals in the nation and leads a prominent global financial consulting firm." Emily blinked, struggling to absorb the details. "Absolutely. It's entirely logical for a billionaire to dedicate his time to rescuing awkward bridesmaids in hotel corridors." Her friend suppressed a soft chuckle. "He embodies enigma, chillingly methodical, detached from personal connections, and rumored to possess the power to dismantle careers with a mere phone call." Emily took a deep breath. Excellent. She had not only come close to knocking him over, but she had also displayed rudeness towards him. With her eyes shut tight, she inhaled deeply. Understood. The wedding was taking place. She simply had to get through the ceremony, steer clear of any further mishaps, and, above all, resist the urge to glance at Brian Fisher. Yet, when she finally opened her eyes once more, she found him still observing her. He arched an eyebrow, as though he was fully aware of her thoughts. A chill coursed through Emily, sending a shiver down her spine. A sense of anticipation lingered in the air, hinting that this night was only getting started. How about we engage in a fun little activity with those who focus solely on the comments? Drop a pizza in the comments. Only those who have journeyed to this point will truly comprehend. Let us proceed with the narrative. Emily was not the type to be easily intimidated. Yet, in that instant, surrounded by the other bridesmaids and attempting to concentrate on the ceremony, she sensed the heaviness of that stare upon her. Brian Fisher. She sensed his gaze lingering, even without turning to confirm it. She sensed it. The atmosphere seemed to dissolve, isolating that captivating and mysterious essence in the space around me. You've been toying with your hair for 5 minutes now. The bridesmaid beside her gently brought her back to the present moment. Emily froze, a rush of warmth flooding her cheeks. Have I? Absolutely. And would you believe it? He continues to gaze in your direction. Emily shut her eyes briefly. Excellent. Exactly what I was looking for. What could possibly draw a billionaire CEO's gaze towards me? I'm merely an architect who nearly collided with him. Her companion merely shrugged. Who can say? Perhaps he enjoys a bit of a challenge. Emily let out a soft sigh, attempting to concentrate on the ceremony unfolding before her. Yet, as the bride and groom exchanged their vows and the guests released heartfelt sighs, she remained unable to dispel the lingering sensation. The wedding reception was alive with energy. The ballroom shimmered with warm golden lights, a gentle melody wafted through the atmosphere, and guests glided between tables adorned with exquisite decorations, as waiters gracefully navigated the space, balancing trays of sparkling champagne glasses. Emily focused intently on her responsibilities, assisting Clara, ensuring the bride was comfortable, and above all, steering clear of any further awkward situations. Yet, as is often the case, the cosmos appeared to have different intentions. As she reached for a glass of wine from a waiter's tray, her movement was swift, and once more, she found herself bumping into something solid. The shadowy fluid erupted in a chaotic spray. Time stood still. She paused, her breath caught in her throat, as the calamity played out before her in excruciating detail. The crimson blot seeped into the immaculate weave of the ebony suit. Emily glanced upward, her heart racing as she locked eyes with Brian Fisher, his blue gaze piercing through her with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. Please tell me this isn't real, she murmured, her fingers lingering on the empty glass. Brian looked at his shirt, then back at her, his face revealing nothing. Indeed, it happened. Emily took a deep breath. I'll fetch a napkin. Hold on, I can take care of that. Before she could complete her thought, he coolly took off his jacket and rolled up his sleeves with a measured ease. Take it easy, it's merely wine. She blinked, taken aback. So, you're not planning to take legal action or kick me out of the gathering? A subtle lift appeared at the corner of his mouth. Not just yet, but if you're looking to redeem yourself, how about joining me at the bar? Emily blinked once more. Was that a beckoning call? Feels more like a trial. It hinges on your response. She surveyed her surroundings, searching for a way out. Yet deep down, despite all that had transpired, there was an undeniable allure about him that captivated her. Perhaps it was the serenity, the assuredness in his tone. Perhaps it was the manner in which his eyes appeared to observe her with unspoken curiosity. Perhaps it was merely a sense of wonder. All right, but I'll be the one picking the beverages. Brian gestured toward the bar. Astound me. The bar in the ballroom exuded luxury, yet it was enveloped in a serene silence at that moment. The sparse presence of guests at the counter created a cozy atmosphere, enhancing the sense of intimacy in the space. Emily perched herself on one of the tall stools, arms crossed in a thoughtful pose. I ought to indulge in something extravagantly pricey just to witness your response. Brian inclined his head slightly. Do you really believe I would be concerned about the cost of a beverage? That's precisely why it would be enjoyable. He laughed, and a slight tremor coursed through her spine. Brian Fisher chuckling? That was truly a remarkable sight. As the bartender made his way over, Emily confidently placed her order. 2 glasses of whiskey. Brian lifted an eyebrow in curiosity. Remarkable, she shrugged. Did you really believe I would choose a fruit cocktail? It seems you enjoy catching others off guard. The whiskey was presented, and she lifted her glass, contemplating it for a brief moment. So, Brian Fisher, do share with me, she turned to him. A subtle smile danced upon her lips. What brings a high-powered CEO to a wedding that seems so out of sync with his typically reserved demeanor? He twirled his drink thoughtfully before responding. As the best man for the groom. Is your social life really just a series of dull corporate gatherings? Brian chuckled once more, and Emily experienced a peculiar sense of fulfillment. Perhaps, but what are your thoughts? I hold the title of Bridesmaid of Honor, which signifies my presence is a matter of obligation rather than personal preference. And yet, it appears you are finding pleasure in this experience. She savored a sip of whiskey, experiencing the comforting warmth cascade down her throat. Well, the evening took quite a turn after I accidentally spilled wine on the guest of honor and nearly sent him tumbling in the hallway. Emily let out an exasperated sigh. Seems like you're holding on to that for dear life. Huh? Most likely not. They lapsed into a moment of quiet, yet it was a silence that held no discomfort. It was the sort that held an unvoiced tension, a presence that hovered between them, gradually intensifying. Emily averted her gaze, feigning interest in her beverage. Do you often gaze at others in that manner? What do you mean? As if you're attempting to unravel their mysteries. Brian smirked. Only when I believe it merits the endeavor. Emily felt a sudden rush of emotion. What was unfolding in this place? With a steadying inhale, she finished off her whiskey in a single, decisive gulp. This has been enjoyable, but I must return to the bride now. Brian made no attempt to intervene. He simply observed her as she rose, his eyes remaining locked on her form. Catch you later, Emily. She paused briefly, then offered a faint smile. Catch you later, Mr. Fisher. Yet, as she turned to leave, an inkling stirred within her that this was not the end of their dialogue. The wedding buzzed with energy, yet Emily sensed a shift within her after that talk with Brian Fisher. There was an elusive sensation that stirred within her, quickening her heartbeat in a way she couldn't fully articulate. She strolled back to the bridesmaid's table and grabbed a glass of champagne, attempting to overlook the reality that, mere feet away, Brian continued to observe her. Clara materialized next to her, a playful grin dancing on her lips. I noticed the intriguing exchange between you and the enigmatic groomsman at the bar. Emily let out an exasperated sigh. It was merely a light exchange of words. Nothing extraordinary. Is there really nothing remarkable? Clara arched an eyebrow. That man was completely captivated by you throughout the ceremony. Even from a distance, his gaze remains fixed. Emily chuckled softly, her nerves evident as she brought her drink to her lips. You're overstating things. He's simply captivating. Fascinating? Clara let out a soft laugh. Emily, that man is among the most influential billionaires in the nation, and according to what people say, he tends to keep his distance from others. If he has an interest in you, it's likely because he perceives something unique. Emily shrugged, yet the flush creeping up her cheeks was unmistakable. He simply enjoys delving into the intricacies of human behavior. That's all. And to be truthful, I'm simply a regular architect. Someone like him would never pay attention to someone like me. Clara let out a deep sigh and gently shook her head. Oh, Emily, you truly fail to grasp it, don't you? Before Emily had a chance to reply, a groomsman approached Clara, requesting a dance, which left her solitary once more. However, it won't last long. Are you really going to continue acting like you haven't seen us exchanging glances for hours? Emily shut her eyes briefly before gradually pivoting around. Brian was present. Excessively near. I wasn't looking at you, Emily said quickly, attempting to sound nonchalant. Brian tilted his head slightly, his intense gaze studying her, causing her heart to race. It seems you're not very good at deception, are you? Emily folded her arms and released a mocking chuckle. Is this how you always are? Or do you take pleasure in unsettling others? A subtle lift appeared at the corner of his mouth. I enjoy watching and grasping the nuances of human reactions. Up to this point, you've proven to be quite the intriguing revelation. That's great to hear. Now, if you would be so kind as to excuse me. She attempted to pull back, yet Brian softly grasped her wrist, just enough to halt her movement. Join me in a dance. Emily's eyes grew large with surprise. Excuse me? A single dance. That concludes everything. She gazed at the dance floor, where pairs were already swaying to the gentle melody. Then she faced him again. And what if I decline? I would suggest that you are not being truthful once more. Emily bit her lower lip, struggling to suppress the smile that was on the verge of breaking free. Your arrogance is simply overwhelming. Are you aware of that? Brian paused for a moment, then reached out with his hand. And still, you find yourself here contemplating my proposal. Emily inhaled deeply. What damage could it cause? She intertwined her fingers with his. As Brian guided her to the dance floor, Emily sensed that everything else had faded away. His arms encircled her waist with a subtle assurance, as his strong hand clasped hers. You've been here before, Emily remarked, attempting to overlook their proximity. Shall we dance? Several occasions? However, not in this manner. She raised her gaze, locking eyes with him intimately. What sets this time apart? Brian observed her intently for a moment before responding. Me. A chill coursed over Emily's skin. The room buzzed with life, yet in that instant, it seemed as though only they inhabited the space. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to meet his gaze without hesitation. For she sensed that something significant was unfolding in this moment. A matter she simply couldn't overlook. Perhaps she had no desire to do so at all. Emily found herself in a state of uncertainty. Indeed, she was aware. She found herself dancing with Brian Fisher, a man whose reserved demeanor and intimidating presence were matched only by his surprising persistence. Yet, she couldn't quite grasp why it seemed so instinctive. The ballroom buzzed with energy, yet all else faded into a haze as he guided her gracefully across the floor, each movement seamless and fluid. It was in that moment that she discovered the depth of her passion for dancing. Or perhaps it was simply that Brian had an uncanny ability to grasp her hand just right, to caress her waist, to make every gesture feel effortlessly delicate, uncomplicated. Are you taken aback? His rich voice echoed close to her ear, sending a thrill coursing down her spine. Ought I to be? You were surprised to find out that I can dance. Emily fixed him with a piercing gaze. No, I did not. However, I suppose it is logical. I imagine you picked this up just like you have with all the other lessons life has thrown your way. Because maintaining a facade was essential. Brian wore a sly smile, a hint of intrigue dancing in his gaze. Is your straightforwardness a constant trait? It's only when my curiosity piques. So, Emily, go ahead and share. What other things spark your curiosity? Emily parted her lips to reply, yet his stare unsettled her composure. In that fleeting moment, her thoughts slipped away, leaving her momentarily speechless. That seems unjust. What is not? Your captivating gaze pulls me in, leaving me struggling to articulate a single thought. Brian emitted a soft, amused laugh. It's not my responsibility that you lose focus so quickly. With a heavy sigh, she resolved to take a step back. However, the moment she stepped back, Brian grasped her hand. Are you already making your escape? Emily arched an eyebrow. I stand my ground. He observed her intently for a brief moment. Then demonstrate it. Emily folded her arms across her chest. In what way? After a brief pause, he finally spoke, suggesting we meet for coffee tomorrow. Emily paused, uncertainty flickering in her mind. The prospect of encountering Brian again the following day was alluring, yet fraught with uncertainty. Fortunately for her, the music concluded precisely at that moment, and she gradually distanced herself as though nothing had transpired. Brian remained still, observing her with a gentle smile. The gathering was coming to a close. As guests began to bid their farewells and the bride and groom engaged with the final well-wishers, Emily sensed it was the perfect moment to take her leave. The day had stretched on endlessly, leaving her mind a jumble of disjointed reflections. She glided out of the ballroom, making her way toward the hotel entrance, where the guests' vehicles awaited. She reached for her phone to request a ride, only to be met with a notification that read, "No drivers available at the moment." Excellent. She inhaled deeply, contemplating the idea of lingering a bit more, when a recognizable voice reached her ears from behind. "It seems your attempt to break free didn't quite go as planned." Emily gradually pivoted and discovered Brian Fisher beside her, his hands tucked into his suit pockets, wearing that keen gaze that made her feel uneasy. "I'm not escaping. I'm simply heading back home, though I don't have a ride. That's merely a minor point." Brian inclined his head just a fraction, as though scrutinizing the circumstances. Without a moment's pause, he declared, "I'll take you." Emily scowled. "And you? Excuse me? I will take you home. The hour is late, and it doesn't seem wise for a woman to be waiting alone right now." She folded her arms across her chest. "I am capable of handling my own affairs. I never claimed you couldn't, but what's the point of waiting when I'm about to depart?" Emily nibbled at her lip. Taking a ride from Brian seemed off for countless reasons. Being in a car with him was an invitation to endless teasing, with no way to escape his playful jabs. Secondly, there was an undeniable quality about him that sent her heart racing in an unusual manner. She cast her eyes on the app once more, wishing for a driver to materialize, yet the display remained unchanged. "All right," she finally conceded, but only because there was no alternative left for her. Brian remained silent. He casually opened the car door, pausing for her to climb in. Emily inhaled deeply and eased herself into the passenger seat. Once he entered and turned the key, a hush enveloped the vehicle, and there was a profound stillness. The glow of the city lights danced through the windows as they made their way down the road. Emily nervously toyed with her fingers, caught in a dilemma between initiating a conversation or simply enduring the ride in silence. Brian, in contrast, appeared entirely at ease with the quietude. "Is it your habit to drive solo?" she finally inquired, merely to alleviate the unease. He cast a quick look in her direction before responding. "There's something captivating about driving under the night sky. Assists in my contemplation." "Oh, so you have the capacity for thought?" She playfully arched an eyebrow. Brian offered a brief smile, the kind that lingered just long enough to leave a deeper impact than intended. "Are you really questioning that? You seem to embody an enigma. Does that trouble you?" Emily paused for a moment before responding. "I believe that to be the case." "What is the reason?" "Your presence exudes a certain intensity, as if you possess an unwavering command, as though nothing can ever rattle you." Brian fell silent for a moment, seemingly weighing her words carefully. Then, without diverting his gaze from the road, he stated with a steady tone, "You have no idea the impact you have on others." Emily's eyes grew large with surprise as she turned to face him. "Excuse me?" He remained silent for a moment, maintaining that enigmatic half-smile, his fingers at ease on the wheel. He continued, speaking as though I were the sole enigmatic figure in this dialogue. "However, Emily, I believe you may not fully grasp the extent to which you captivate those around you." She averted her gaze, a sudden and unfamiliar sensation swelling within her chest. It was merely a light-hearted remark. Perhaps it was not. The vehicle came to a halt at a crimson signal, and Brian shifted his gaze in her direction. "Your discomfort around me stems from the belief that I scrutinize you excessively. However, the reality is that you captivate me, and I enjoy delving into the things that captivate my interest." Emily parted her lips to speak, yet silence enveloped her. She found herself torn between irritation at his audacity and a sense of flattery from it. The remainder of the journey to Emily's apartment unfolded in a serene silence, devoid of any awkwardness. The silence hung thick with unvoiced reflections, each of them grappling with the weight of recent events. As Brian arrived at her building, Emily exhaled softly, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. She felt a deep sense of gratitude upon returning home, but an undeniable sensation lingered within her, hinting that something profound had transpired between them that night. She faced him, a sense of urgency compelling her to speak before departing. "I appreciate the lift." Brian tilted his head ever so slightly, his gaze examining her with an intensity that sent her heart racing. "It was a delight, Emily." She paused, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. A certain quality in his voice sent a shiver racing down her spine. Desiring to escape the unsettling sensation, she swung open the car door and stepped out, ensuring to shut it gently behind her. As she ascended the steps to the entrance, an unexpected impulse compelled her to glance back, and upon doing so, she caught sight of Brian lingering there, observing her. Emily averted her gaze and stepped inside with purpose. As the elevator doors sealed shut, she pressed her back against the wall and exhaled the breath she had been holding in. What just transpired? The following morning, Emily entered the construction firm's office, expertly balancing a cup of coffee in one hand while clutching several reports in the other. Following a weekend of avoiding thoughts of Brian Fisher, she resolved to return to her usual routine, yet an unsettling feeling stirred within her. She had persuaded herself that their paths would never cross again. He was a billionaire CEO, navigating the world of high-profile investors and boardroom meetings, while she was an architect dedicated to her designs. Their paths were unlikely to intersect once more. At least that was her belief. Emily entered the conference room, clutching a folder filled with project documents in one hand while balancing her coffee in the other. Her colleagues had gathered, engaged in conversation, as Oliver Harris, the director of the firm, perused important pages regarding the Richmond Tower, the company's most daring endeavor. She took her seat, preparing herself for yet another lengthy, detailed meeting. Yet, the moment she raised her gaze to identify the person at the head of the table, her heart sank. Brian Fisher. He stood there, clad in a perfectly tailored suit, his intense and discerning eyes poring over the documents as though this were merely another transaction. Emily stood still. This simply cannot be occurring. As if attuned to her arrival, Brian raised his gaze gradually, and for an instant, time seemed to freeze. Her blue eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, the atmosphere in the room thickened, charged with an unspoken tension. To her utter surprise, Brian stayed calm and greeted her with a neutral, professional demeanor. "Ms. Carter." Emily blinked, almost spilling her coffee. Is he acting like this is just fine? Perceiving the uncomfortable stillness, Oliver promptly intervened. "Emily, I'd like to introduce you to Brian Fisher, who will be taking the role of our lead investor for the Richmond Tower project." Her stomach churned. "Excuse me? Mr. Cut Fisher and his investment firm have taken a position in the project's financing. He will serve as our strategic ally as we progress." Emily glanced from Brian to Oliver, then to her colleagues, noting that no one else appeared taken aback by this revelation. Only she remains. Brian remained silent. He observed with a serene demeanor as she grappled with the shocking revelation that had just unfolded. Emily inhaled deeply and managed to put on a polished smile. "Greetings, Mr. Fisher. It's a pleasure to have you here." "Thank you," he replied, a faint smile gracing his lips, yet his eyes conveyed a different story altogether. Following the meeting, Emily was resolute in her desire to leave the place as quickly as she could. She craved a breath, a moment to digest the whirlwind of events that had just unfolded. However, it was clear that Brian Fisher would not allow it to go unnoticed. Just as she was about to leave the conference room, his voice called out to her from behind. "Is that you, Emily?" She briefly shut her eyes, then gradually pivoted to face the other direction. "What is it exactly?" Brian observed her intently, his arms crossed in contemplation. His impeccably fitted suit only enhanced his naturally authoritative demeanor. With a scoff, She folded her arms, offering no warmer welcome. Do you hold the position of my superior now? Not quite, but collaboration is essential. Emily sensed a parched feeling in her throat. Were you aware of this? Brian tilted his head ever so slightly, a glimmer of amusement dancing in his eyes. The instant I spotted your name on the project team, I knew something special was about to unfold. And you didn't consider that might be uncomfortable? I believed it would be intriguing. Emily expressed her wit and charm. She squinted her eyes. Perhaps you had a hand in shaping it. Brian's smile spread gradually. You're overestimating my abilities, Emily. She found herself torn between the urge to escape and the impulse to hurl her coffee at him. Yet one certainty lingered in her mind. There was no way out of this now. The Horizon construction office lay in utter stillness, broken only by the swift tapping of keys and the rustle of turning pages. Emily fixed her gaze on the documents scattered across her desk, attempting to disregard the figure of Brian Fisher, who occupied a chair on the opposite side of the meeting room. Following the startling discovery that he was a key investor in the Richmond Tower project, she found herself compelled to confront the truth. Collaboration would be essential for the upcoming months. It appeared that Brian was relishing the moment a bit more than necessary. Is that your usual expression when you're deep in thought? Her thoughts were abruptly cut off by his voice. Emily gritted her teeth before raising her gaze. Do you frequently pose random inquiries when you ought to be focused on your tasks? Brian inclined his head, a subtle grin playing on his lips. It's only in the pursuit of understanding another that I find myself engaged. Emily folded her arms, a look of skepticism on her face. What is it that drives your desire to comprehend me? He rested his elbows on the table, observing her with a piercing gaze that sent a flutter through her stomach. Your intrigue captivated me, Emily. She was at a loss for words. Her cheeks flushed, prompting her to swiftly redirect her gaze to the papers. Yet Brian's journey didn't end there. How about we head out for dinner? Emily blinked, taken aback. Excuse me? It's essential that we discuss the specifics of the project. It will yield greater results than working late at the office. This isn't exactly an invitation. It's merely a tactic to push me into working extra hours. If that simplifies things for you, then yes. Emily let out a weary sigh, acutely aware of her limited options. All right, but I'll choose the restaurant. Brian smiled, and inexplicably, it sent a flutter of excitement through her. The restaurant exuded a small, cozy charm, standing in stark contrast to the upscale venues Emily envisioned Brian frequenting. You truly led me to such a straightforward place? He inquired, glancing about. I have modest preferences, Mr. Fisher. He let out a soft laugh as he reached for the menu. Do you really believe someone in my position wouldn't find this enjoyable? It seems that individuals in your position are only familiar with culinary offerings that have names too complex to articulate and prices that rival my monthly earnings. Brian lifted an eyebrow in amusement. While you may have a point, exploring new avenues can often lead to unexpected discoveries. Emily chuckled, shaking her head in amusement. If you maintain that opinion after experiencing the flavors here, then I will take you at your word. As they placed their order, Emily observed that for the first time since their collaboration began, Brian appeared more at ease. The familiar tension lingered, yet there was an intriguing shift in his tone, suggesting he was savoring the moment. He began, leaning his arms on the table. What is the appeal of architecture? Emily paused, uncertainty flickering in her mind. Could you clarify what you mean? Has this been your aspiration all along? She merely shrugged her shoulders. From a young age, I found joy in crafting and reshaping environments. Architecture offers me the opportunity to transform lives. Brian nodded, appearing truly engaged. And have you done so? Emily smiled, recalling one of her initial endeavors. Once, there was a client, an elderly woman, who sought to remodel her home to better suit her grandson, who had suffered an accident and was now paralyzed. Upon completing the project, tears streamed down her face. She claimed it would transform his existence. Brian paused for a moment before responding, "That's commendable." She chuckled gently, Please refrain from complimenting me in that manner, Mr. Fisher. I'm accustomed to your challenges at work. Perhaps I simply enjoy witnessing your irritation. Emily sensed a flush creeping across her cheeks. You defy all odds, and yet here you remain. The waiter arrived with their food, interrupting the moment abruptly. Emily swiftly seized her utensils, attempting to dismiss the reality that Brian was indeed correct. She remained present, relishing the moment more than one might expect. After what felt like an eternity, they finally departed from the restaurant as night fell. The urban glow bathed the avenues, while the refreshing night breeze offered a welcome contrast to the heat within. Feeling a bit drowsy, are we? Brian inquired as they strolled toward the car. Not exactly, but if you're set on bringing me back to the office, I'll play along. He chuckled softly. Not in the slightest. The evening is quite pleasant. Shall we embark on a stroll? Emily arched an eyebrow. Brian Fisher meandering aimlessly without a defined direction. How intriguing. You mentioned that exploring new experiences is beneficial, right? She let out a sigh of exasperation, yet she didn't decline. They meandered leisurely through the tranquil streets, unhurried, simply observing the various random sights around them. Emily could hardly believe how laid-back Brian was acting. Have you always been this way? She inquired abruptly. What do you mean? Quiet? Chilly? Brian appeared deep in contemplation. Experience has instilled in me a sense of caution, yet it doesn't diminish my capacity to feel deeply. That response took her by surprise. A quietude enveloped them, yet it held no discomfort. It brimmed with an ineffable essence. Emily looked at him and understood that, for the first time, Brian Fisher appeared to be relatable. That was perilous. Extremely perilous. Emily awoke that morning, her thoughts swirling in a fog. She was still reflecting on the events of the previous night. The dinner, the surprisingly effortless dialogue, and the realization that, defying all reason, she had found pleasure in Brian Fisher's company. That was not satisfactory. That wasn't how things were meant to unfold. She sprang to her feet, as though the act of staying occupied might chase the thoughts from her mind. She had to put in the effort. She had to concentrate on the Richmond Tower project and, even more crucially, maintain her distance from Brian. However, the moment she stepped into the Horizon construction office, it became clear that this would not be a straightforward task. When Emily walked into the conference room, Brian was already there. He occupied the head of the table, his demeanor serene and intent on the papers laid out before him, as if the events of the previous night had never transpired between them. With a moment of uncertainty, she paused, inhaled deeply, and moved ahead. "Good morning," she uttered, imposing a veneer of formality that didn't resonate within her. Brian glanced at her, a faint smile gracing his lips. "Greetings, Emily. Did you have a good night's rest?" She gritted her teeth. He was fully aware of his actions. "Absolutely." Brian nodded, a hint of amusement dancing in his eyes at her reply. As the remaining members of the team trickled in, the meeting commenced. Emily compelled herself to concentrate on the intricate specifics of the project, the structural modifications, and the financial plan. However, it was simply unfeasible to overlook his presence. Occasionally, she sensed his eyes upon her, and with each instance, her pulse raced. Yet she kept it hidden. Following a gripping hour-long meeting, the team began to break apart. With her notes in hand, Emily rose to her feet, poised to exit before Brian had the chance to utter a word. But just as she was about to leave, he called out, "Emily." She paused for a moment, then steeled herself to appear utterly unconcerned before turning to confront him. "Indeed?" Brian shut his folder and rose, straightening his jacket. "I would like to talk about some project decisions with you." Emily inhaled deeply. This was a task. Simply focus on your tasks. Understood. Shall we proceed with it now? Certainly, he remarked, lifting his coffee cup and gesturing for her to come along. They strolled to the office balcony, a serene spot frequently utilized for casual discussions. The morning sun illuminated the city beneath, casting a vivid contrast against the palpable tension that lingered in the atmosphere. Emily rested against the railing, arms crossed in a thoughtful pose. What specific topic would you like to discuss? Brian observed her intently for a moment before responding. Yesterday evening. She tensed immediately. What happened last night? Indeed. Emily squinted her gaze. I believed our purpose was to discuss the project. Brian flashed her a small, irresistibly captivating smile. We can discuss both topics. She let out a frustrated breath. Listen, Brian, what took place last night was a professional dinner. That concludes everything. Do you really think so? Emily parted her lips to reply, yet the look on his face caused her to pause. Uncertainty lingered in the air, and he was acutely aware of it, prompting her to bring the conversation to a close in that very moment. I must be on my way, she stated, pivoting to depart. Brian observed her intently for a moment before uttering a remark that brought her to an abrupt halt. You're intentionally distancing yourself. A chill coursed through her body. This is not related to you in any way. Indeed, it does. She glanced at him, irritation evident in her expression. What makes you believe that the world centers on you? Brian moved in, his aura enveloping the distance that separated them. I understand this game, Emily. She paused, the air caught in her lungs. What game are you referring to? The contest of separation. You're distancing yourself because there's something within you that you're reluctant to acknowledge. Emily felt a knot in her stomach. Your perspective is entirely mistaken. Brian inclined his head just a bit, as though scrutinizing her every response. Then gaze into my eyes and declare that you felt nothing last night. Emily took a deep breath. She wished to refute it. She wished to express that it all held no significance. Yet, beneath the surface, she was aware that it would be untruthful. And the issue was, Brian was aware of it as well. The stillness enveloping them was profound, laden with an unspoken tension that neither dared to identify. At last, Emily paused to reflect. This is of no significance. I have tasks to complete. She turned and left, leaving him with unspoken words hanging in the air. Yet, as she departed, a heaviness settled in her chest. She understood that eventually, the time would come when she could no longer escape. Emily occupied herself for the remainder of the day, attempting to dismiss the dialogue with Brian on the balcony, persuading herself that he was mistaken, that she harbored no feelings at all. Or at least, that was the mantra she repeated to herself. Yet, as the hours slipped by, the act of turning a blind eye to the truth grew increasingly difficult. The strain between them had been escalating ever since Clara's wedding. Initially, she attempted to brush it off as mere teasing, a playful exchange of provocations that held no real significance. However, at this moment, his presence now stirred a disquiet within her that she could no longer ignore, and Brian was aware of it. As the workday drew to a close, Emily collected her belongings and made her way to the office kitchen, seeking a brief pause to catch her breath before heading home. She took a glass of water and leaned against the counter, shutting her eyes for a brief moment. In that moment, she sensed the presence of someone standing beside her. She recognized the presence instantly, even before her eyes fluttered open. It seems like you're keeping your distance once more. Brian's voice carried a low, measured quality, yet an undercurrent of something more profound lingered beneath the surface. Emily inhaled deeply, gathering her thoughts before she turned to confront him. I'm not trying to evade you. I'm focused on my task and aiming to minimize interruptions. He arched an eyebrow. So now I'm just a diversion? You have always been that way. The words escaped her lips before she had a chance to hold them back. As the realization of her words sank in, a flush crept across her cheeks. Yet Brian offered merely a faint smile, as though he had anticipated that response from the very beginning. At last he spoke, his voice sinking to an even softer tone. Emily folded her arms across her chest. What comes next? You're finally acknowledging it. She exhaled in exasperation, turning her gaze elsewhere. I'm not acknowledging anything. Indeed, you are. As he moved in closer, an unexpected warmth enveloped the space between them. Emily, you can continue to act as if this isn't unfolding, but we both understand that it is. She took a deep breath. Are you curious about what's going on, Brian? This isn't something I can prioritize right now. He appeared unfazed. He paused, observing her intently before he responded. You find the moments for everything, yet struggle to confront your own emotions. Emily shut her eyes momentarily. This was a perilous endeavor. This is not acceptable. Why not indeed? As she opened her eyes, their gazes intertwined. As a result of our collaboration, Brian's smile unfolded gradually, and in that instant, Emily realized he was not one to surrender without a fight. What if we chose not to? She paused, the air caught in her lungs. Brian leaned in just enough for her to sense his presence, charged and electric, like a storm on the verge of unleashing its fury. Share with me, Emily, if I weren't in the role of your investor, and if you weren't so entangled in these constraints and limitations, what path would you choose? Emily was at a loss for words, for she had always possessed that inner knowledge. Brian did as well. The stillness enveloped them, thick with an unspoken tension. At last, Emily stepped back, shattering the moment. I must take my leave. Brian allowed her to continue without interruption. He stood there, observing her retreating figure, and the instant Emily crossed the threshold, an undeniable shift settled in the air, marking the end of an era. The following day, Emily endeavored to maintain her routine following the encounter with Brian in the kitchen of the Horizon construction office. Yet, the reality was that everything seemed out of place now. The atmosphere between them was thickening, and she realized that eventually, she would need to come to a conclusion. But what type of choice? She felt uncertain. Deep within, a whisper urged her to simply allow it to unfold. Yet logic consistently triumphed. Collaborating with Brian suggested that any engagement between them would inevitably result in complexities. Integrity, principles, standing, the stakes were incredibly high. Thus, she concluded that maintaining her distance was the wisest choice. But Brian Fisher was not the sort of man to accept defeat lightly. As the clock approached midnight, Emily finally found a moment to break free from her work. After examining the blueprints for the Richmond Tower project, she stepped into the shower and then sank onto the couch, utterly drained. Her mind was a whirlwind, and she craved an escape. Suddenly, her phone buzzed with a vibration. She reached for it, anticipating a mundane notification, but her heart raced when she glimpsed the name on the screen. Brian Fisher. She paused, contemplating whether to open the message. Brian, I would like to have a conversation with you. It holds significance. Emily shut her eyes and inhaled deeply. A portion of her wished to dismiss it, yet another part, the one that had been spiraling lately, craved to understand his intentions. Is this related to the project? No. Her throat felt parched. In that case, it can be postponed until tomorrow. She secured her phone, cutting off any chance of his response, and rested her head against the back of the couch, overwhelmed by fatigue. However, the reality? She understood that this was far from the conclusion. Indeed, she was correct. The following morning, upon her arrival at the office, Emily quickly observed that Brian appeared even more intense than he typically did. He refrained from speaking to her directly, yet his gaze conveyed all he wished to express, leaving her feeling uneasy. In the course of a project meeting, Brian consistently sought to provoke her at every opportunity, challenging her ideas, questioning her proposals, and fostering an atmosphere thick with tension. When it all came to an end, Emily felt a surge of frustration that compelled her to take action instead of letting it go. Once the other employees had departed, she approached him. May we have a conversation? She inquired, maintaining a steady tone. Brian shut his folder and regarded her with a serene demeanor, yet one brimming with unspoken motives. Absolutely. They entered a vacant meeting room. Emily shut the door with a decisive click and folded her arms across her chest. What was that all about? What was that? Brian responded, seemingly oblivious to the subject at hand. The relentless teasing throughout the meeting. Are you pushing the boundaries of my patience? He inclined his head just a bit, as though observing her every action with keen interest. What if I am? Emily let out an exasperated sigh, clearly annoyed. What is it that you seek, Brian? As he moved nearer, a thrill surged through Emily, quickening her heartbeat. I believe you understand my desires. She took a deep breath. This is not acceptable. What's stopping us? Due to its complexity. Life is a tapestry of complexities. Emily. Her patience was wearing thin. Brian, we collaborate closely. That's quite a significant issue. He took his time before responding. He observed her intently for a brief moment before finally uttering words that transformed everything. Imagine if I shared that I'm stepping away from the project. Emily's eyes grew large with surprise. Excuse me? Brian inhaled deeply. I am in the process of transferring my interest in the Richmond Tower to a different investor. Emily sensed a knot forming in her stomach. This is absolutely wild. What is the reason? He offered her a subtle smile. Now, there's no longer any reason for you to keep fleeing. She was utterly astonished by what she was hearing. One cannot simply abandon an investment due to this situation. I have the freedom to choose my own path, Emily. All I desire is you. The quiet was overwhelming. Emily found herself at a loss for words. All the barriers she had constructed, every justification she had employed to distance herself from him, had vanished now. And that terrified her more than anything else. She had to escape that place. I require a moment to reflect. Brian nodded, his gaze sharp and focused. Consider, Emily, but consider with caution. She exited the room in haste, her heart racing. Yet, beneath the surface, she understood that her ability to flee was fading fast. Emily stepped out of the meeting room, a sense of instability washing over her as if the very ground beneath her feet was giving way. Brian Fisher had truly accomplished it. He walked away from a multimillion-dollar investment because of her. His words lingered in her mind, resonating with an undeniable intensity. I have the freedom to choose my own path, Emily. All I desire is you. She craved an escape, a moment to inhale deeply, to reflect. She sought an escape. Yet, regardless of her surroundings, his gaze was all that captured her attention. His gaze lingered on her, a knowing glint in his eyes, while she stubbornly held back the truth. Emily strolled to her office, oblivious to the bustling crowd surrounding her. She snatched her belongings in haste and departed silently, not uttering a word to anyone. At this moment, she found herself unable to cope with the situation. Night had fallen by the time she became aware of her aimless wandering, which had stretched on for nearly an hour. Her legs ached with fatigue, her thoughts surged like a tempest, yet no resolution felt truly fulfilling. She entered a serene cafe, requested a robust coffee, and settled by the window, observing the bustling city beyond. Emily had always been the type to resist yielding to anything or anyone. She had consistently prioritized logic, placing her professional ambitions and autonomy above all else. Then Brian Fisher appeared on the scene. He pushed her boundaries, stirred her emotions, awakened feelings she wished to keep at bay. And now, he had dismantled the final obstacle she had relied upon to maintain her distance from him. What if I didn't hold the role of your investor? What actions would you take? With her eyes shut, she clutched her cup firmly. Emily was certain of the answer. However, acknowledging it proved to be a different matter altogether. When she finally arrived home, the clock had already struck 11. The apartment lay shrouded in darkness, enveloped in an eerie silence. She flung her bag onto the couch and released a deep, weary sigh. Her phone buzzed softly. She picked it up, and upon seeing the name on the screen, her heart raced with anticipation. Brian Fisher. Emily paused for a brief moment. She had the option to overlook it, to act as if it were invisible to her. Yet, in that moment, she caught sight of something that caused her to halt in her tracks. It was not a message. Call had been made. He was making a call. She took a deep breath before responding. Emily. His voice resonated with a rich depth, unwavering and, more than ever, laced with unspoken motives. What is it, Brian? She attempted to convey a sense of indifference. May we have a conversation? Emily shut her eyes, striving to maintain her composure. We've had our fill of conversation at the office. I'm not referring to my job. The quiet lingered between them. Emily sensed a constriction in her chest. I'm uncertain if I can handle this at the moment. Just let me know when. She was at a loss for words. Brian let out a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. I'll catch you tomorrow then, Brian. Sweet dreams, Emily. The conversation concluded before she had the chance to voice her objections. She gazed at her phone for a moment, her breath uneven. In that instant, she understood a truth that was as frightening as it was unavoidable. She had no desire to run. She longed to see him. The following day began much like the previous ones, or so Emily attempted to convince herself. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, her unease intensified. She was certain that Brian would come for her, and he always gave his all. As the clock chimed 6, Emily was busy collecting her belongings in preparation to depart. She had to return home, detach from it all, and find some clarity in her thoughts. However, the moment she exited the office, Brian was waiting for her. He stood by his car, clad in a pristine suit, his piercing gaze captivating and impossible to overlook. Emily halted. Are you truly going to act as if you didn't notice me? He inquired, remaining still. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, ready to embrace what lay ahead. What is it that you seek, Brian? He swung the car door open. Come on in. I am not, Emily. She shut her eyes, understanding that resistance was futile. She had a strong desire to leave. However, acknowledging that was a different story. In quietude, she slipped into the car. Silence enveloped them as they drove. The air crackled with unspoken tension between them. Brian kept the destination a secret. Yet, Emily was aware that he was making his way to his penthouse. For the first time, she chose not to engage in a dispute. The vehicle came to a halt, and Brian was the first to exit, gracefully opening her door. Emily paused for a moment before ultimately stepping out. The ascent in the elevator was devoid of sound. As the doors swung open, Brian guided her into the expansive living room. Emily found herself unable to tear her gaze away from him. Every single aspect of this man filled her with discomfort. He removed his jacket, loosened the collar of his shirt, and poured 2 glasses of wine, offering one to her. She accepted it and took a sip, attempting to dismiss the unsettling proximity of him. What brings me to this place? At long last, she posed the question. Brian observed her intently for a moment before responding. As you chose not to flee, her heart raced with intensity. What if everything falls apart? He advanced a step nearer. And what if it succeeds? Emily took a deep breath. Every fiber of her being urged her to go, to escape while the opportunity remained. Yet, she could no longer deceive herself. She desired him. In that instant, everything else faded away. The dread, the uncertainties, everything faded away as Brian gently cradled her face and pressed his lips against hers. In that moment, Emily understood that there was no way to retreat. Brian's kiss embodied all the trepidation and longing that Emily had experienced simultaneously. It was undeniably intense, without a doubt, as if he had been aware that this moment was destined to arrive, sooner or later. And she, who had battled this for an eternity, found herself unable to resist any longer. She desired him. Brian drew her nearer, one hand placed softly on her waist while the other tenderly cradled her face. Emily sensed her thoughts evaporate, her fingers clutching his shoulders as if seeking a lifeline. Time appeared to freeze. But then, the truth crashed over her like a tidal wave. What was she up to? Her breath came in quick, uneven gasps, and her heart pounded fiercely within her chest. Emily recoiled abruptly, shoving Brian aside just enough to sever their connection. I am unable to do that. Brian paused, his gaze fixed on her. He appeared unfazed. It appeared as though he had anticipated this response. What is the reason? He inquired softly. Emily brushed her fingers across her face, overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. This is not acceptable, Brian. He stepped back, yet his gaze remained fixed on hers. Provide me with a genuine explanation. Emily struggled to arrange her thoughts, as the chaos within her felt overwhelming. This is absolutely wild. And what defines normality? He responded. She tightened her jaw, filled with exasperation. If I relent, then what follows? What unfolds next? Brian folded his arms, his demeanor impeccably calm. We unravel it as one. She emitted a laugh devoid of humor. Just like that, just like that. Emily experienced a constriction in her chest. I am unable to do that. Brian nodded slowly, but his next words left her even more unsettled. I won't pressure you, Emily, but it's time to be honest with yourself. She paused, the air caught in her lungs. The quiet lingered between them. She turned and walked away, not glancing back, fully aware that everything had shifted irrevocably. The subsequent days proved to be a true trial of resilience. Emily steered clear of Brian at the office whenever possible. She offered brief responses in meetings, averted her gaze, and lingered a few minutes afterward to ensure she wouldn't encounter him. Yet, he certainly didn't simplify things. Brian refrained from initiating discussions, yet he made no effort to conceal his anticipation for her presence. Whenever their gazes intertwined, Emily experienced the same tumultuous struggle within herself. It was ripping her to shreds. Until one fateful night, everything came crashing down. Emily found herself departing the office well into the evening. Engrossed in the intricate details of the project blueprints, she completely lost track of time. As she collected her belongings and made her way outside, the building had nearly emptied out. The hallway was illuminated by just a handful of security lights. And then, just as she rounded the corner, he appeared. Brian lingered by the parking lot exit, propped against his car, as though he anticipated her arrival at that precise moment. Emily stood still. For a moment, she considered the option of dismissing him and simply turning to leave. Yet, she understood that she couldn't, for beneath it all, her desire to see him lingered. She longed to hear his voice. She had grown weary of this struggle. Emily paused, her eyes fluttering shut as she contemplated her choice. She approached him with measured steps. Have you been anticipating my arrival? Brian lifted an eyebrow, yet his expression remained unfazed. What are your thoughts? She released a deep, weary breath. Brian, please enter the vehicle. Emily folded her arms across her chest. And what if I decline? He just smiled. It's unlikely that you will. She tightened her jaw, exasperated by his unwavering confidence. Yet, beneath the surface, she understood he was correct. Emily stepped into the car. Brian made his way to the driver's side, settled into the seat, and turned the key in the ignition. Where are we headed? She inquired. You are already aware. And she certainly did. Brian's apartment remained exactly as she recalled. Flawless, structured, and naturally sophisticated. Yet, on this occasion, an unmistakable shift lingered in the air. Perhaps it was the realization that she had stopped attempting to escape. Perhaps it was the realization that, for the first time, she truly desired to be present. Brian removed his jacket and faced her. Emily. She raised her gaze to him, holding his stare this time. Speak your truth. He moved in, pausing at a distance that allowed her to sense the heat of his being. What is it that you desire? His voice carried a serene confidence, yet it sent a shiver down her spine. Emily paused before responding, fully aware of her desires. She had been aware from the start, and now all excuses had vanished. Brian's smile spread gradually, conveying his desire. Then cease your flight. She remained silent. For the first time, she found no need to respond. As Brian grasped her hand and drew her nearer, Emily realized that retreat was no longer an option. She had ventured beyond the boundaries of logic and longing. She felt no remorse. The following morning, Emily stirred awake to the gentle morning light streaming through the curtains. She needed a moment to grasp her surroundings. The expansive bedroom, the fresh linens, the subtle aroma of timber and cologne lingering in the atmosphere. In that moment, a memory surfaced. She pivoted gently, her gaze falling upon Brian Fisher, who remained in a deep slumber beside her. He reclined on his side, his breath flowing deep and even, entirely relaxed, in stark contrast to her. Emily found it impossible to unwind. What had she accomplished the previous evening? The solution was clear, yet the deeper inquiry remained. What significance did it hold in the present moment? With great care, she eased herself out of bed, collecting her garments strewn across the floor. She moved with deliberate slowness, careful not to disturb his slumber. She required a brief pause to gather her thoughts. Just as she reached for her blouse and began to slip it on, his voice resonated behind her. "Are you escaping once more?" Emily stood still. She pivoted gradually and discovered Brian alert, observing her with that piercing stare. He leaned back against the pillow, the sheets draped casually at his waist. His hair tousled just enough to be infuriatingly charming. She took a deep breath. "I'm not going anywhere." Brian arched an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. "So, why does it seem like you're attempting to slip away without rousing me?" Emily gritted her teeth. "I required a moment to reflect." He fell silent for a moment, observing her intently, as though attempting to decipher her innermost thoughts. He let out a deep sigh. Emily paused, uncertainty flickering in her mind. Brian and Emily. He extended his hand. She understood that accepting it would leave no room for further justifications. Yet, before doubt could creep in, she took a step forward and rested her hand in his. Brian drew her back onto the bed, his gaze fixed intently on hers. "Do you wish you had done things differently?" Emily inhaled deeply. She ought to, yet she chose not to. Negative. Brian's lips formed a subtle smile. "So, just let go of the overthinking." She longed for the ability to do so, yet the reality was that her thoughts were in disarray. "What comes next?" she inquired gently. Brian glided his finger across her cheek, mapping an unseen route. "Now we shall observe the path ahead of us." Emily maintained her focus on him. For the first time, she understood that Brian was just as entangled in this as she was, and that filled her with even greater fear. In the days that followed, Emily and Brian settled into a silent cadence, a routine neither articulated, but both instinctively grasped. Let's enjoy ourselves a bit with those who merely skim through the comments. Leave a comment with Pepsi. Only those who have journeyed to this point will understand. Let us proceed with the narrative. In the workplace, they maintained their usual professional demeanor. There were no gestures, no prolonged gazes, no indication that anything was different. Yet it indeed had. The tension between them intensified with each passing day. Whenever they found themselves alone in the office, Emily sensed a palpable tension in the atmosphere. Each dialogue seemed heavy with hidden motives. Each look seemed to carry an unspoken understanding. And as night fell, they found themselves drawn to one another. It felt like an unseen force was drawing them back, time after time, until eventually, it became insufficient. Emily sat at her desk, meticulously going over the last tweaks to the Richmond Tower project when her phone buzzed. She lifted it and noticed a brief note. "Brian, please make your way to my office." Her brow furrowed. A surprise encounter? She tucked her papers neatly, picked up her tablet, and strolled down the hallway, making an effort to appear inconspicuous. However, the moment she entered his office and shut the door behind her, it became clear that this was no ordinary meeting. Brian stood by the window, his hands tucked into the pockets of his suit, gazing out at the sprawling cityscape. He appeared to be on edge. Emily closed the door with a decisive click and folded her arms across her chest. "What is it exactly?" Brian pivoted with deliberate slowness. In that instant, she sensed that something was amiss. "It's time for a conversation." Emily paused, her breath caught in her throat. He had never initiated a conversation in that manner. "What are we discussing?" Brian advanced a step nearer. "Our story." Her stomach churned. "What is our situation?" He inhaled slowly, weighing his words with precision. "This situation is escalating beyond my initial expectations." Emily felt a constriction in her chest. "Is that an issue?" Brian hesitated before responding, and that was sufficient for her to grasp. A sharp flavor lingered on her tongue. "Are you ready to bring this to a close?" Brian raked his fingers through his hair, a clear sign of his mounting frustration. I'm uncertain. She took a step back. Are you unaware? He gazed at her intently, his eyes brimming with turmoil. Emily, you understand I'm not the type to get entangled in things. Her heart felt heavy. So what prompted you to begin this? Brian remained silent. In that instant, Emily came to a profound realization. She was utterly absorbed in this. What about him? He remained uncertain. Emily released a dry chuckle, shaking her head in disbelief. You claim to be the type who stays detached, yet here you find yourself entangled. Brian tightened his jaw, a silent struggle evident in his demeanor, as if he yearned to voice his dissent but found himself unable to do so. Emily let out a soft sigh, attempting to push aside the increasing ache within her. If you're sharing this with me now, Brian, it's clear that you've already come to a decision. He remained silent, and that pain cut deeper than any words ever could. Emily was not the type of woman to plead. She remained steadfast in her identity, refusing to alter herself for anyone. Thus, she took the sole action available to her. She stepped back and declared, "All right." Brian's expression was one of astonishment. Emily, there's no need for further words. I comprehend. She pivoted and exited swiftly, ensuring he wouldn't catch a glimpse of the tears welling in her eyes. Emily chose not to return home that night. She wandered through the city for hours, searching for a means to escape the emotions that enveloped her. Yet it seemed utterly unattainable. She had succumbed to the charms of Brian Fisher, and now she had to forge ahead without him. Ultimately, he was never prepared for her. Emily chose not to attend work the following day. She lay awake through the night, her gaze fixed on the ceiling, searching for a way to ease the pain that throbbed in her chest. However, a straightforward answer eluded us. She had erred in allowing herself to fall for Brian Fisher. Now he was making an effort to escape before the moment slipped away from him. For her, the issue was that it was already too late. The following morning, she reached out to HR, informing them that she required a day off. She switched off her phone and chose to ignore it for the remainder of the day. She required some distance. As the second day unfolded without Emily at work, Brian realized he had erred in his judgment. He had passed the night in restless wakefulness, revisiting each phrase of their dialogue. I tend to keep my distance from involvement. The gaze Emily cast upon him in that instant lingered in his mind, an unsettling presence that refused to fade. For the simple reason that it was not accurate. He played a significant role, exceeding what is necessary, more than he was willing to acknowledge. He transformed into the very thing he dreaded above all else. For the very first time, he found himself at a loss, uncertain of how to navigate the situation. As the afternoon waned, Emily heard the chime of the doorbell. Her expression darkened. She had not anticipated the arrival of anyone. Yet, the moment she swung the door wide, her heart froze in place. Brian Fisher stood there, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, eyes sharp and resolute. With a firm grasp on the door, she prepared to close it without hesitation. No, she replied with a flat tone. Brian stood his ground. May we have a conversation? I have no words for you. However, I have a message for you. She gritted her teeth. I've already heard enough, Brian, he sighed, running a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. I acknowledge my mistake. Emily experienced a constriction in her chest, yet she remained resolute. Indeed, you were. He gazed at her. For the first time, he appeared to show a sense of vulnerability. Emily, I struggle to navigate my feelings effectively. That has never been a part of my existence. I never required it. She let out an exasperated sigh. That's wonderful to hear. Now, please enlighten me on how that relates to my situation. Your influence is undeniable. You transformed everything. She parted her lips to respond, yet silence enveloped her. I felt the urge to step back before the situation escalated further. Yet, the reality is that it has indeed occurred. Emily paused, her breath caught in her throat. Could you clarify what you mean by that? Brian surprised her in the most unexpected way. He moved closer, gently cradling her face in his hands, and softly confessed, "I'm in love with you." She became utterly still. "Excuse me?" He gazed at her with a sincerity that was unmatched. "My heart is captivated by you, Emily, and I find myself utterly adrift in this feeling." Emily's heart raced, caught off guard by the unexpected words from Brian Fisher. Yet, in that moment she came to a chilling realization. She wished for him to find his way. She was determined to seek him out. Emily inhaled deeply and grasped his hands. "Then cease your flight, Brian." He remained silent. He leaned in, closing the distance, and pressed his lips against hers. And this time neither of them held back. The kiss shared by Emily and Brian stood apart from all the rest. This time there was a definitive clarity, a finality to the escape. Truly happened. In that moment, Brian embraced her with a fierce intensity, as though he feared she might vanish, while Emily's heart raced wildly within her chest. She could hardly believe he would utter such words. "My heart is completely yours." Their words resonated within her, and she responded with a kiss that held every ounce of passion she possessed. As they finally separated, Brian leaned his forehead gently against hers. His eyes fluttered shut, as though relishing the experience. "This time, I won't let you slip away," he murmured. Emily beamed gently, her heart brimming with joy. "What if I express that I have no desire to attend?" Brian opened his eyes and gazed at her, a fresh and intense light flickering within them. "Nothing in this world can stand in my way when it comes to claiming you as my own." The ensuing months became the most joyful period of Emily's existence. She and Brian ultimately embraced their feelings, and while collaborating continued to pose difficulties, they discovered a way to find equilibrium. On those charged meeting days, they clashed over contracts and deadlines. On serene evenings, they savored meals, exchanged laughter, and indulged in secret kisses in the kitchen. For the first time, Emily experienced a sense of wholeness. She adored him, and Brian, a man who had always been composed, logical, and wary of feelings, discovered how to love her in the most profound, genuine way imaginable. Yet, he sensed that an essential piece remained absent. He devised a strategy for it. That evening, Brian whisked Emily away for an extraordinary dinner. They had been together for nearly a year, and she felt a shift in the atmosphere, yet she remained unaware of the impending turn of events. The restaurant featured an intimate terrace, illuminated by gentle lights that twinkled like distant stars. The ambience was refined and cozy, and Emily felt her heart quicken as she observed Brian appearing more anxious than he typically did. "How are you holding up?" she inquired with a grin. "I've never felt more certain about anything in my life." Her eyebrow arched, curiosity piqued. Before she had the chance to utter another word, Brian rose from his chair. Emily furrowed her brow, a look of perplexity crossing her face. "Brian, who are you?" Yet her voice faltered in her throat the instant he knelt before her. Emily sensed time freeze around her. The eatery that surrounded them faded away. The cacophony, the brilliance, the crowd, all blurred into the background, leaving only Brian Fisher in sharp focus, kneeling before her, presenting an open velvet box that cradled a breathtaking ring. His eyes brimmed with feeling, yet his voice remained calm and assured as he finally began to speak. "Emily Carter, this was never in my plans. It's hard to believe that I find myself in this moment, down on one knee, inviting someone to embark on a lifelong journey together." Emily sensed the sting of tears welling up in her eyes. "But then you appeared," Brian continued, a smile gracing his face, "and transformed my entire existence. You awakened emotions within me that I never believed possible. You ignited a desire within me for something I never realized was essential." She clasped her hands over her mouth, struggling to contain her feelings. "My dearest Emily, my heart is yours, and I long to share each and every day of my life by your side. I long to share laughter with you, bicker over trivial matters, explore the globe, and return home with the comfort of knowing you'll be waiting for me." He grasped her hand with conviction, gazing deeply into her eyes. "So, would you consider becoming my partner for life?" Emily released a breathless laugh, tears cascading down her cheeks. Indeed, absolutely, without a doubt, yes. The restaurant burst into cheers as Brian placed the ring on her finger. He rose to his feet, drawing her into a kiss that was both deep and passionate, brimming with unspoken promises. In that instant, Emily understood. No force in existence could sever their bond. They were meant for one another, for eternity. The day unfolded beautifully. The azure expanse above stretched endlessly. A soft zephyr danced through the air, and the sun cast its tender glow, embracing the dawn with warmth. Emily could scarcely fathom that this day had truly arrived. She donned a breathtaking white gown, adorned with intricate lace that accentuated her silhouette, and a flowing veil that cascaded elegantly to the ground. Her hair was arranged in a sophisticated updo, and her hands quivered gently as she grasped a bouquet of pristine white flowers. Within the hall, the guests assembled, eagerly awaiting the moment they had all been looking forward to. Yet for Emily, amidst the throng, there was only one individual who held significance, and he stood there, patiently awaiting her arrival. Brian stood at the altar, clad in a pristine suit, yet it was not that which captivated her gaze. His gaze lingered on her, filled with a reverence that suggested she was the most valuable treasure he had ever encountered. Emily pressed her lips together, stifling the urge to cry, and started her slow walk down the aisle. With every step, her heart raced quicker. As she finally stood beside him, Brian gently took her hand and whispered, "You look beautiful." With a gentle smile, she awaited the officiant to commence the ceremony. Each utterance resonated with a significance that eclipsed all else in existence. But the moment Emily had anticipated her entire life arrived when the officiant inquired, "Brian Fisher, do you take Emily Carter to be your wife, pledging to love her, honor her, and remain by her side for all the days of your life?" Brian grasped her hand more firmly. His eyes sparkled with deep emotion, and his voice remained steady yet brimming with sentiment as he replied, "With all my heart, yes." Emily experienced a tightness in her throat, and as the officiant faced her, she believed her heart could overflow with joy. "Emily Carter, do you accept Brian Fisher as your husband, vowing to love him, honor him, and remain by his side throughout your life?" She inhaled deeply, gazing at the man who had transformed her existence in every conceivable manner. And then she beamed with all her heart. "Absolutely, without a doubt, eternally yes." Brian chuckled softly, his gaze brimming with affection. "With the authority granted to me, I hereby declare you united as husband and wife." Before the officiant could complete the sentence, Brian drew Emily near, encircling her waist and kissing her passionately, prompting cheers and applause from the guests. She chuckled softly against his lips, experiencing a joy beyond her wildest dreams. What are your thoughts on the tale of Brian and Emily? Share your reflections in the comments. Please provide a rating for this story on a scale from 0 to 10. What is your score? Be sure to subscribe and enable notifications so you won't miss any of our narratives. Be sure to explore additional heartfelt narratives by clicking here on the final screen.